שלום לכם. צהריים טובים לכם. האולם גדוש לא רק בזכות העניין שאתם מגלים בדיון הזה, אני מנחשת אלא גם בגלל האלטרנטיבה ההלכה מאוד בחוץ.
I understand you're all here also because it's so hot outside and here it's so air conditioned, so I'm sure that's one of the reasons. The title is The Shifting Sands of Terror. I looked for a verbal definition for shifting sands. So shifting sands are sands that are unstable, that are made of strong quartz grains, which are not well connected. Those grains shift from one place to another, and in that they create changing dunes. With the wind, large quantities of sand can cause a lot of destruction and damage to agriculture. Shifting sands go all over the place and they can either cover plants or deroot them. Usually in the desert there are great winds that can go up to 250 meters and sometimes 100 kilometers. And the wind shifts the sands and they can advance 40 meters an hour and to bury anything that's underneath them. If I have to add to the interpretation to this text, a conference that deals with the terror and its evasiveness, its power, its shifting from one place to the other and destroying everything under it, these are good definitions. But shifting sands are a natural phenomenon. And here, when we deal with all the aspect of terror, we're going to deal with issues that are handmade by humans. We're talking about processes that are impacted by bigger processes, economies and their significance. They shape the current and the future battlefield that for us are the arenas of our coping. And now in this hour, we will start with the Hamas between the Fatah and Salafists, but this session is held in memory of Tzafir Bar-Or, who was 32 when he fell. He was a commander of Golani. He was born in Acre, and never met his son Harel. Tzafir started in 2009 to study in the IDC, in governance and diplomacy. That's where he met Sivan, who became his wife. He was drafted to the army, to the Golani Brigade, and with the years became a commander. During the protective edge, he fell in Sajaiya, and Colonel Roy Levy, who commanded the division in the summer of 2014, he's a friend of Tzafir and his commander, and today he's a regiment commander. And I'd like to call upon his commander to talk about Tzafir as a person. Good afternoon, everybody. Tzafir for me. The polarity which is confusing between a melancholy sense that is connected to the loss of Tzafir is a nostalgic kind of emotion. When I talk about him, when I remember him, apparently he's continued to accompany because it happens in 1 minute. All of a sudden, a laughter, and then the pain. And it clarifies to me that you cannot shut reality behind the door. Tzafir was killed in battle in Protective Edge about a year ago in Sajaiya. We had face-to-face battles in the alleys of the village, 3 foci, everything together. There were terrorists, and the mission was to eradicate them. Yes. The enemy had casualties, but so did we. It's a very complicated situation. My deputy, Tzafir, for special missions. For that, he existed. I called him, I showed him the hiding place of the terrorists, the difficulties, just a step between me and him. And that was it. A missile was launched from far above. It killed him and Zvika, my driver. And so, in the middle of the mission, he was cut away from us. And this typifies a lot of the Israeli heroes who were killed in battle. This is Tzafrir of the people of Israel. Tzafrir, in my eyes, just like in the eyes of all of us. He's a combatant, a commander, fearless, with a rich battlefield experience, but he had also a sense of humor, and he was so nice, he was so cynical. And I want to talk about him this way. We were in a maneuver, and he was a commander of Golani, and we got a mission from our revered commander to do something before we leave. We're all influenced by the characteristics of such a mission. Pressure, hunger, tiredness. We're at the point of time where we've finished to look at the mission, and now it's the time to go and do it, and to introduce the combatants to the mission. This long night awaits us, and this is the time that Tzafrir calls me to the side, and like two kids, we start playing with the rubber snakes that he liked so much. He had exactly the method how you have to pack these snakes and how they stick to each other in the heat, a whole doctrine. The combatants were tired, they organized themselves to go out, and suddenly we hear the shouts of our commander, tells us all to go and to start preparing ourselves. And after 2 minutes of noise, whatever, the commander is looking at us. The rubber snakes are between our teeth. This is the time, and all of a sudden he says, "Are you okay?" And I say, "No, it's too far. I can't see. According to the hand movement, I think I can see something." And he says, "Wait for 2 minutes here. You'll see something, and I promised you we're going to go out on time." Tzafrir disappeared. What happened? The vein in the forehead of the commander told us we shouldn't be too close to him. Suddenly, I see Tzafrir standing next to him, next to the commander, back to back, and he yells at the combatants to start getting organized. Think about it, he says. Look at the timetable. And the commander looks at him, and then he looks at him with anger and continue to push the combatants. Only at the second time he processed the picture. Tzafrir is standing next to our commander with a weapon, his face painted in black, and an Afro-American huge wig on his head, and he yells at the soldiers, "Get organized, get organized." How did he get this wig of an Afro haircut in the middle of battle? I don't know. But with tears in my eyes, I come out of my hiding place. Tzafrir, you need a shrink. You have to go to a psychiatrist. I can give you a recommendation. And back to reality, I went to their wedding, Tzafrir and Sivan. 6 months ago, I saw the baby, Harari. Today, I'm a friend, a comrade. I try to help Sivan with all the problems of life. Phone from Sivan, "Hi, what's happening? I need some help." "What? Anything. What do you buy as a gift for a bar mitzvah, for the family? I was invited. What do I do?" "Where is Tzafrir?" I'm thinking to myself. What kind of question she's asking? Anyway, I have to help her. So I try to get some relevant information. What time is the bar mitzvah? Where exactly? Where are you? Well, a few interim conclusions. I try to help Sivan, and I have to share everything with her. Well, I have a friend who knows a friend who has a souvenir shop. I call him. I tell him the story about the friend of Sivan. Tzafrir. I'm talking about a hero here, about a combatant, and he says, I have an idea. Coin of the Antiquities Authority, where you can see embedded the Masada with a whole story about the battle that took place in Masada, the mountain, everything, the heroism, the encouragement, Tzafrir, Masada, American, Sivan. It looked like a perfect solution. Sivan was very enthusiastic about it, and she introduced doubt in my mind. And she says, what do I write now? You know, the passage between the concrete present, how to get it, how to bring it, and the happiness, and all of a sudden the reality, to start thinking, how do I connect Tzafrir to this reality, to explain the idea in nice words. The connection between a family, happiness and bereavement really took everything out of me. To explain this repeating motive, it's so unnatural, and the price that we paid then for our freedom and our hope today to live like normal human beings without Qassams over our heads and tunnels under our feet. What is the connection between Tzafrir, that I know, with his Afro-American wig, and the national symbol of heroism? How do you solve this dichotomy? What do I write? She says. You're so strong, Sivan. Yes, strong, she says. Write. Masada shall never fall again. No price, even in the price of my beloved husband. Thank you, Colonel Ro'i Levy. And now to the Hamas. I can say that all the preparations I did yesterday, introduction to this panel, I could throw to the garbage this morning when I heard that last night the woman who was burnt in that attack died from her wounds, that the Hamas already is announcing that the vendetta is on its way, and you can have a whole discussion about the place of the Hamas, what kind of a role it takes upon itself, and where is it on the axis between the Fatah and the Salafists. And I'm still processing that, and again I hear that Abu Mazen plans to bring to the vote a decision in his organization, the intention to do away with the Oslo Accords, to withdraw and to go to the UN. So here, another connection between Fatah, the PLO, PA, the Salafites, PLO, that who leads what and how everything goes around and turns around in such a speed. What is this, if not exactly what are you talking about when you say shifting sands? We have with us, according to the sitting, it's Brigadier General Yossi Kuperwasser. You don't have to applaud, right? Okay, forget the applause. He was the former senior advisor on Palestinian affairs in the Ministry of Defense, and together with him, Ben-Barak, the Director General of Ministry of Intelligence in the ICF and other places. Okay. Next to him, Dr. Anat Kurz, Director of Research, Institute of National Security Studies. Bassem, Founding Director of Palestinian Human Rights Monitoring Group, a very active person in B'Tselem organization, political commentator. Brigadier General Shalom Harari, Associate ICT, former Senior Advisor on Palestinian Affairs in the Ministry of Defense, and last but not least, in any dimension, General Shlomo Sami Turgeman, Commander of the Southern Command of the IDF, also during Protective Edge. He's about to retire, so maybe he'll be freer to talk to us and to give us a review about the Hamas, the way you cope with it today in view of 1 year after Protective Edge.
Good afternoon, everyone. Please forgive me, but I will not begin talking about Hamas before I talk about Safrir. And just in one sentence or two, because I believe that Ro'i has described so well who Safrir was, his abilities, his character, his family, his roots, home he grew up in, and fortunately for me, I have gotten to know Safrir in exactly the same exercise that Ro'i talked about with a wig, the African-American wig. I came to meet an officer who really was a spectacular person, who knew how to connect many people to him, a person who can command not because of his rank, not because of hierarchy, but due to the power of his character, and to lead both frames and people, and to do so both professionally and determination. Despite his humor and everything, he had a vast experience in combat, and no less importantly, the ability in complicated and harsh situations to come out with a good outcome. And as Ro'i described in the battle in Shaja'iyya, we had 3 soldiers killed, and Ro'i himself was injured during this incident. He was badly wounded, actually, and we're very happy to have him here with us today. I'm sure he will continue with his abilities to continue as a commander. I think that this incident of Safrir Bar-Or and Tzvika Kaplan and Moshe Malekov and the soldiers who were injured in the battle in Shaja'iyya is an outstanding example of the challenges that our warriors had to cope with during Operation Protective Edge. This challenge is huge, and the outcome that they have managed to bring about is tremendous and remarkable versus this enemy called Hamas. And fortunately for me, I was intimately and closely in connection with his family, and I know that his ability and his memory and his impact on his soldiers and other people is certainly there, exists among us all, and also among the soldiers who were with him. We can talk a lot about Hamas on different levels, historically, in future, in terms of the future, in terms of the political and the military. But as an opening for this panel, and not to speak too long, I want to talk about the complexity of the organization called Hamas, an organization which is a very complex entity. Hamas has many facets and many aspects. I don't want to focus on all of them. I want to focus on 4 aspects which I think constitute a basis for the opening by Tali as well. The first aspect is Hamas between a rival and an enemy. And Hamas in a daily conduct has both in it. Hamas between a terror organization and a military organization. And here again, Hamas can bring the 2 components together. Between Hania and Mashal as the political echelon, and between Def and Sinwar on the other hand as the military leaders. And finally, Hamas between Fatah and the Salafiyah. This complex entity that can combine so uniquely the in-between, not to be something very identified and very limited. It's part of the challenge, it's part of the separation that Hamas is doing between its long-range objectives and its short-range objectives, and also stems from the strategy it has, which is to have all the channels open, to be both a state and a military wing, to be a military organization, an army, but also a terror organization, to work with Fatah, but also with the Salafis, to battle against them in Gaza, but also to cooperate with them in the Sinai Peninsula. And this complexity can be run because of this logic, to have the strategy open, channels open on all levels, in all directions. This has to do, first and foremost, due to the low point it has. And in the Gaza Strip, you have to preserve every channel possible that will give you support or aid of any kind. And that is the reality that Hamas is in. As for the first dimension, between a rival and an enemy, we must remember, and we mustn't be confused, and we must not go after slogans and be confused by them. Hamas is first and foremost an enemy. The main objective of Hamas has not changed, and it is to terminate the state of Israel, to extend. That is a process. It has stages, but this is something that it wants to do. It wants to eliminate Israel and to govern all of these areas. And in the long range, it wants to replace Israel. And our point of view is also to replace it in the Gaza Strip. We don't want to see Hamas remaining in the Gaza Strip. It should not carry on forever. In the short range, the calm period in the south and in the Gaza Strip depends upon both sides. We know that strategically speaking, vis-à-vis the Gaza Strip and specifically Egypt, because it has no support, Hamas is completely dependent upon us in order to remain in governance, in order to remain the way it is governing Gaza. And the silence or the quiet, the calm, is also in its hands because it has sovereignty in the Gaza Strip. This mutual dependency brings about the fact that you are in a reality that is complicated also in emergency, also during Protective Edge and other operations such as Pillar of Defense and Operation Cast Lead. First of all, you want to really hit Hamas hard so that it can go back to square one, deterred and weakened. But you don't want it to be so hardly hit that it collapses its regime and then governance will come back to you. So that was part of the logic behind Operation Protective Edge. But we must say that even though it was the same in other operations as well, it may not be the same in future operations. And if Hamas were to think or assume that this is the only strategy Israel has, then that will be a mistake, and it will be jeopardizing its regime and this project it has built in the Gaza Strip. As a rival, this is the address in the Gaza Strip. That is the government, that is the sovereign entity. The Hamas is responsible for everything in the Gaza Strip. We know it, the world knows it, and other organizations within the Gaza Strip also acknowledge the sovereignty and control of Hamas. As a rival and a temporary interest, we have common interests with Hamas. The first common interest is to prevent a humanitarian crisis in Gaza Strip, especially after Protective Edge, after it has been hit hard. We don't want to have a humanitarian crisis there, and therefore we allow all of the abilities within that area. The second interest is to prevent jihad organizations from developing. We see what is happening around us. We see what is happening in the Sinai Peninsula in terms of ISIS and the other organizations. And we don't want such organizations to grow and develop in the Gaza Strip. And the third is to prevent chaos in terms of regime, because wherever we have reached a governing chaos, the outcome was much worse. The second tension is between a terror organization and a military organization. On the day-to-day, the Hamas is a military organization par excellence. It has the structure, it has the abilities, it has the warriors, it has the commanders, it has the HQs. It works just like any other military organization. But in terms of its objectives, it utilizes its capabilities as a terror organization per se. It builds its force and its military capabilities as an army on the one hand, as we know it. It has army logics. The Hamas has a defense logic, an attack logic. They have both naval and land capabilities. If you look at the first force structure, you really see the military structure we know from other military organizations. But if you look at the objectives are those of a terror organization par excellence. And how is this So how does it appear as a military organization? First of all, there are development labs, there's R&D within the Islamic College and other places in the Gaza Strip. Chemists and engineers and all such professionals are sitting there and developing the military capabilities, and there's also a military industry there. Most of the rockets that have been used and launched in Protective Edge were manufactured and developed within the Gaza Strip, as have been other capabilities. There is a large military infrastructure, there is HQs, there is manpower, there have dozens of thousands of activists in the Gaza Strip. The military wing of Hamas is the largest employer in the Gaza Strip, and it provides people with employment security. It's not the PA, it's not the government ministries there. They have people working for them, but if you're in the military wing of Hamas, you have much more employment, it's much more dominant. All of these military capabilities Hamas directs as a terror attack. It is against our cities and our civilians, whether it's the rockets, whether it's the other capabilities they have, and also when it comes to the logic of to go into, infiltrate into our area, to attack within Israel, underground, and to attack our cities and citizens. That is a terror attack par excellence. The third logic is that most of the military activity of Hamas comes out of sensitive sites, whether it's densely populated areas within its own areas, not because of a constraint geographically. It is part of its perception to work within this densely populated and well-built and sensitive sites in order to bring Israel into the Gaza Strip and to create this collateral damage to show the world the next day. And intentionally I did not bring any PowerPoint slides or any videos, but I could have shown you how hospitals are used as launching sites, and mosques and schools and clinics, and from UNRWA facilities. Of course, the Hamas has developed over the years. This is not the time to expand on that, but we must understand that today we have a military organization that is built, as I've said, like a military organization, battalions, divisions, and so forth, and a lot of resources out of the few resources that go into the Gaza Strip are diverted to Hamas building its force. The other component within this logic is that we see how this organization is working also in routine times, out of these patrols with observations, with the posts, in order to retain governance, in order to retain sovereignty in the area. This military organization knows how to also be active within the envelopes that most armies also work within, and this is the reality in the Gaza Strip. The last point I would like to make in this aspect of military and terror, that this development, this advancement of its military capabilities have brought it from the logic of the past that you should just be happy that you're not losing, is that today, and today they actually have a higher standard of achievements. Now Hamas wants to have an achievement, it wants to have a bargaining chip and not just to not lose. And we see that part of its propaganda after Protective Edge is to market incidents under propaganda and to create some sort of an image as if they have a bargaining chip. Therefore, its expectations are higher, but at the same time, due to this logic of having a state within the Gaza Strip and the military organization, the price of its loss is also higher. The third component is the political echelon and the military echelon between Hania and Def and we have four people that are actually the key figures. They represent the various facets of the organization, whether in terms of outlook, whether in terms of challenges, whereas it's the movement or the society within the Gaza Strip. Briefly, each one. Hania is the civil face, so to speak. He has to retain governance, and he has the control and responsibility and vis-a-vis the society, the citizens in Gaza. And he wants to govern Gaza, to control Gaza, and this is a very complicated place. Very basically, they are in distress. 44% of the people in the Gaza Strip are 0 to 14 years old. They have over 40% of unemployment. They have 50% young people up to the age of 20 or so. They don't have many growth engines, and they have an energy crisis. And when it comes to the water, and these days, when it comes to protective edge, Hamas is much more aware of what is happening, much more aware of the needs of society. Also has to do with the Arab Spring. And Mash'al, he's looking for the international support. He looks more towards expansion to the West Bank. He is outside of the problems in the Gaza Strip, and that was very well expressed in the protective edge. He did not feel what they felt in the Gaza Strip and what they saw, and therefore he was able to remain in the air-conditioned gyms and to make decisions that are contradictory to reality in the Gaza Strip. Death, of course, represents the contradiction, the resources being diverted into the underground infrastructure, the demolition, tunnels, the death tunnels, and he also looks through the prism of the military. He wants to win the war. That's how he sees it. Sinwar is in a key position. He is very much connected to the military wing, but he also looks to the political echelon, and he is perhaps looking to military career. So he has the outlook that combines both. And I think that was important to say that even though we are trying to classify them into groups sometimes, I think that each one can also look at the other interests, the other party's interests, and they are trying to balance it out and to respect one another. As a perception, the perception is not to go against the government, go against those who are the leaders, but in extreme situations, in crises, perhaps this perception does not remain intact. We see compromise, we see mediation between the various sides in order to reach agreements without having a crisis and with the aim of a convincing. It is important to say that Operation Protective Edge, I think that it brought more understanding and also deepened the gaps between these leaderships. The dominance of the military leadership is there, but they are also part of the decision-making in the political echelon, because they finished with this operation without having any real achievement, and that is why they are now inquiring into this to see how they have taken part of this process in order to learn for the future. Of course, they have disagreements about the future, about what will allow the Gaza Strip to come out of this distress. If 50 days of combat did not bring about a better condition for them, why would the next operation do? In the military wing, some believe that only force and only a real bargaining chip will bring the solution desired to the Gaza Strip. And the question is, when will they decide which way they are going, if at all? The fourth tension point is between Hamas, Fatah, and the Salafiya. Here too we see Hamas, on the one hand, collaborating with the Sinai district, part of the ISIS organization which is in the Sinai Peninsula, but Hamas is also combating extreme Islam, the Salafis that are in the Gaza Strip. In the past, Hamas was the sort of right wing. It was against religious extremism. That was the way it was in the Palestinian society. It was the greatest resistance organization and also the more religious one. And I think that now Salafiyya is challenging it in two ways, because it is also in terms of religiousness, the Salafis are much more strict, much more extreme in terms of their religious outlook. They see the regular Muslims heretics, and also in terms of resistance, the Salafis think that Hamas are not resistant enough, and they have in fact waved this banner. Hamas is very much worried and concerned about these Salafis because they undermine Hamas government, Hamas regime and governance within the Gaza Strip, and it's had several quite extraordinary incidents where it has had to use force against the Salafis. It also undermines the calm period that we're feeling now, because Hamas is being deterred and it's also being restrained after protective exercise, not an interest of it to now stop this calm. And we also see how some activists of Hamas are moving and switching to Salafis, and so Salafis are also posing a threat to Hamas in terms of its ability to retain its status. And therefore we are seeing Hamas using all of its capabilities. Intelligence-wise, it is quite remarkable. We see them doing preventive action and arrests in order to lower the Salafist capabilities, and the Salafists are not exactly having zero outcomes, but they are restrained, and where they cannot use force, they are reaching agreements with them as well, as they have done in the past. Just to sum up, out of the weakness that I see, Hamas is preserving and opening all the channels to all camps in the area. On the one hand, to the Iranians and the Turks, and on the other hand, the Saudis and the Egyptians, or at least it's trying to do so. It's also making sure that it has a flexible strategy in order to exhaust all possible solutions, whether it's calm, whether it's building the force, and whether it's preparing for a day of battle if the need arises and the outcomes does not happen. And there is Tahadiyya and other understandings on the one hand, but also there are also the developments of force. We see that all of these logics are maintained. It is managing to hold the stick from all ends, not even just two, but we're not sure that it will continue this way into the future, so we must therefore prepare for another reality, and that is what we do day and night. That is it for the opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Please just join us. We're going to start a discussion now from these chairs, but also based on what was said here by the Commander of Southern Command, but by other things. This morning there was a declaration of avenging a vendetta on Mrs. Dawabshi's passing away, her death, unfortunate death today. So Hamas is holding the flag of proactivity in the conflict, in the struggle, and therefore to elevate themselves above the other organizations, and they're sort of peeping towards the Salafite kind of equation. But this step where Abu Mazen wants to annul and abolish the Oslo Accords, suddenly we see a situation where the greatest rival of Hamas is trying to promote various processes. And yet at the same time we see so many processes at play here. Well, first of all, good afternoon one and all. I think that Hamas sees itself as someone who is in a state of representation, a conflict on the representation of the Palestinian voice. Maybe it is. They are the authentic representative of the Hamas, of the Palestinians, and therefore they are those who should be spearheading the Palestinian struggle for the achievement and the accomplishment of their national objectives. Yes, they do represent a very significant portion of the Palestinians. Don't forget that they did win in the elections, but they won with a pretty significant win in that election. And therefore, in these circumstances, I mean, whenever something does happen, it doesn't wait for the PLO, for Fatah, or the PA, the Palestinian Authority, to actually approve of something, because they believe that they are the representatives. And I think if there's anything that really that is very problematic, then they do actually represent the actual views even more so than the PA. They recently released a survey that said that 88% of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip see as their main objective as the eradication of the State of Israel, and 81% in Judea and Samaria, they also believe the same. Therefore, if someone is calling upon so unequivocally, is Hamas. They don't need to mislead themselves and say Oslo Accords or anything else. They never accepted the Oslo Accords. Therefore, it's much more convenient for them to say it sort of very loudly and clearly. They don't need to apologize to the PLO nor to the Salafists for their positions and opinions. We have to understand that the Hamas is not only working within the frameworks that the commander of the Southern Commands mentions so in such an outstanding manner, but in general all the other Arab frameworks. And there are implications of this. One is that there is an implication, the ramification on Abu Mazen, the kind of decrease, the sort of deflation of their position. They sort of seem to have devaluated the whole issue of the Palestinian conflict. So to try and draw attention on the Palestinian issue, no one really is able to really dedicate much thought to that. And so therefore the Hamas is trying to renew the attention towards the whole Palestinian issue and renew all the Arab attention towards it. But it's not at the moment in the center of attention. We see what's happening in Syria. We see that very vehement sort of strife in the Islam world. And these are really the most important things on the table at the moment. Number two, most specifically because of that, Hamas is part of that entire setup. In the Arab world, there are three main components that seem to fight each other. That's the pragmatic element, and the Hamas is not one of those, and they're in conflict with them, especially the Egyptians, because they think that they're collaborating, the Egyptians, against those who are fighting against them. Number two are the Salafite Al-Qaeda camp or element, in other words, the Islamic State. And they believe in the realistic views there embedded. They need to fight the entire world. I mean, they're talking about, the Israelis, the colonialists, and there's a group in the middle, and that is a very extremist Islam, but very realistic. They say, yes, we need to change the world. We need to fight with a jihad and everything by force, yes, but we're not willing to actually wage a war tomorrow morning, because if we do, then the same thing will happen now that happened to us last year, because they're still sort of questioning whether they were truly defeated last year or not. I mean, truly, internally, they do know what the outcome was, and they do know. how bad a defeat it was, but they don't actually want to really come out and say that loudly and clearly. So therefore, they're willing to take various risks that they wouldn't have to pay too high a price for, and that's, for example, in Judea and Samaria, but not in the Gaza Strip. They are pro, for example, terror attacks in the Judea and Samaria, but they failed because in Israel there's a first-class operational intelligence group that manages to curb this and to thwart these attempts. And they're trying to, and they're succeeding in thwarting rather than letting them escalate it. So it's interesting to see how they are trying to avenge. The Hamas are trying to avenge the horrific results of the Kfar Duma attack. And in parallel, in the Gaza Strip, they're going to be very cautious and they're going to wait for better days before they can actually wage a second campaign. Mr. Kuperwasser mentioned what the Salafists are saying. They want to prove that they can conquer the world, that the Islam can bring this caliphate, this Islamic caliphate back and really impose it on all. But although they have the strength, the Hamas still has to grapple with what people want. They want to live. And do they want a civilian organization or a terror organization? Will it be a civilian organization who will look after its subjects? First of all, good afternoon. I think that the Hamas, like every other terror organization that is actually governing, it wants to remain there. So if it looks to one side and it sees what happened in Tunisia, Syria, Egypt, then they understand that however strong they are, however terrorists they may be, their civilian population is stronger than them. And therefore, if they want to remain in government, then the Hamas will have to ensure the fact that they also show that they care after the well-being of their population. In other words, they will have to choose a different path than the path of terror. And that is their biggest their biggest dilemma that they find themselves entrenched in. I have a feeling that they have chosen to try and choose that path of concern for the population. We hear a lot of talk about Hudna, which is this lull and this ceasefire. They're trying to find some kind of halachic sort of justification for this time out without giving up on their main objective, and that I do not argue with Kuperwasser about, and that is to eradicate the state of Israel and to come instead of them. But on the way, they're willing to compromise because they understand otherwise that their audience and their target audience may take up arms against them. So if they do show concern for their population, then still extremist organizations around them may suddenly say, you don't represent the real Islam. But I think that most of the Gaza population think that it would be wrong to continue the struggle right now and to be in an ongoing struggle because there are insufferable outcome and results. And the situation there is insufferable at the moment. So therefore, I think that since we are, yes, deliberating here about a terror organization, our greatest challenge at the moment for Israel is to enable them to understand that if the given situation is more convenient, then it will be more comfortable for them to live in. In other words, there should be some kind of understanding that if there's some kind of moderation access, or at least an access that is understanding that they cannot succeed in military terms, but that if they continue imposing their sort of authority on the organizations and there will be a lull, it will be in their favor. In other words, they have to understand that it is for their benefit, in their favor, that this lull and quiet continues. There's the only representative of the official representative of the government of Israel is sitting here. I want to ask him a question. Do you think that Israel, perhaps unofficially, indirectly, would be willing to actually talk to Hamas on a level of actually reaching perhaps understandings with them? And would that be on account of perhaps the PLO and Abu Mazen perhaps connection? Is this an issue of these, you know, the combined vessels? The Prime Minister said, in his words, that we are already in a situation of hudna. In other words, if the situation continues to be quiet in the south, then of course the Israeli side will continue its kind of policies of trying to make life easier, and that is what they are trying to do, and make life much more sufferable and acceptable. But if it continues to be thus held quietly, then yes, then it'll be proved. It must be proven actually in deeds. Now, if we look at the agreements between the Gaza Strip and Israel, if Israel wants to promote this kind of lull and quiet with Hamas, we could basically the message is that we're trying to quieten the tiger because we don't want him to shoot at us. Will the Palestinian Authority and PLO, I mean, their status has been weakened, will they not suddenly start looking for another alternative leader? No, I actually don't think that there should be a connection between that, because alongside what we are doing and how we're trying to sort of alleviate the situation in Gaza Strip, we're trying to do the same in parallel in Judea and Samaria, and the situation is there much better than it was 2 years ago. So if it continues being quiet in Judea and Samaria, it'll continue to be alleviated and the situation will improve. So if we continue with a policy that when you keep to the rules of the game, then everyone benefits from it. But if you continue beating up someone, then you continue being beaten up. So in other words, if the Gaza Strip, if there's some kind of sort of shooting, it might even be something, an errant sort of shooting at thing. What will then happen in order to preserve this situation that you've just described? I think that the equation that you're describing here is relatively simpler. We will not suffer errant fire or any other kind of fire against our southern towns and villages, but we will judge things in accordance to that specific pinpointed situation, and that's what we've been doing, and we will continue doing so. I'd just like to speak to the commander of the Southern Command. How can we keep this low flame burning?
I think that we have a very clear objective, and that is to develop, to grow, to prosper, to allow life and development in the south, in the entire country, in fact. And any way that leads us there is the way that we should choose. In face of the alternatives in the Gaza Strip, the strategic alternatives that Israel has vis-à-vis the Gaza Strip, I think that this alternative of deterrence, of maintaining the quiet and calm, and of managing this conflict by every so often having incursions, I think that is the better option. And therefore, when you have sort of shootings, random shootings or rebel shootings, then we need to approach Hamas, and they should be the people we contact. Well, when you talk about Hamas as a sovereign entity, that is quite an achievement for an entity that was described as a terror organization. And you talked before about the tension between the military and political echelons in Hamas. And I want to ask, what role does the military echelon in Israel have in maintaining the balance? I think that the military echelon in Israel has a significant role to play in the evaluation processes, in the idea development and plan development processes. I'm not talking about plans of military tools or military incursions or use of force. I'm talking about looking at the problem from all aspects, talking about alternatives and plans. I think that there is a routinely held dialogue consistently and significantly with the Minister of Defense, with the cabinet, and I think that these things are very well demonstrated each day, each hour. Thank you very much. Dr. Kurz, do you believe that to restore Gaza, to rehabilitate Gaza, that would be the right way of coping with Hamas in its two extremes? Hello. Hello. I did not have to wait for this question to come, because until now I heard some things that were very interesting and very important that I can take forward. And to a certain extent, I'm very happy that Israel has entered this arena, because it is a factor that has something to say and do. A lot has been said here that, of course, we cannot overrule, but their significance is that Israel is the subject of this matter. The others want to eliminate it. It is there, and Hamas does whatever it can in order to achieve its objective. Of course, I'm not overruling this. I'm not rejecting this, but bringing Israel into the picture, the significance of that, or the meaning of that, is that Israel has something to do. It can be active in order to make the environment it is in, which Hamas is a part of and will perhaps stay for a long time, but to make this environment more easily contained. And the big question is, and I will come back to your question more specifically in a moment, is how can we translate the moves that Israel is doing while recognizing its capabilities and the advantages of its impact on the situation, and to change what is happening and the emphases, including Hamas's channels of activity and the balance between the military and political aspects of Hamas. And in this respect, I also want to qualify the connection we have talked about, which is very poetic, of course, and very attractive or appealing, between the situation we're talking about and the drifting sands. Because if you go to the moon, it doesn't matter if there is a storm in the Sahara Desert. You cannot change this wind and this very threatening structure of the dunes. But here we are again contradicting the same analogy, because we are finding a way to stop or change the wind and to make the dunes sort of be lower, and also the flame lower. And I think that Israel plays a key role here, because if we talk about a tension between activity channels and between different channels of forces between an organization such as Hamas, it's an organization, movement, political party, authorities, everything put together. Israel has the ability and interest, or should have the interest, to change this balance and ratio, and to reinforce this aspect that is less violent, and to change the interests within Hamas, and to rehabilitate the Gaza Strip. That should have a key role. And I talked with Shalom about this when we looked at the view before the session began. The Gaza Strip has been needing this rehabilitation for dozens of years, way before Operation Protective Edge and even Cast Lead. And one day, that's not what we're talking about, but one day someone will ask, what is the role played by distress in the Gaza Strip? And I'm talking about the internal problems of Palestinians as well. I'm not just saying Israel is to blame. but the radicalization within the Gaza Strip has also translated into this balance of powers in Hamas as well. Now, we need rehabilitation for humane reasons, and I don't think anyone can go against that or disagree with that. The rehabilitation required is something that will evoke hope, that will give the people something to look forward to, inter alia, in order to prevent an acceleration of processes whereby people are recruited or mobilized to become Salafia, and we are seeing it happening. And it is not a trend that is unique to Islam or to the Gaza Strip or to Hamas or ISIS. When people are in distress, they seek solutions, and when the solutions are not institutionalized or convenient, then they go to difficult places. It hasn't started in the Middle East or in Hamas. So there are many reasons, for security reasons, for political reasons, humane and moral reasons too, to try and improve the situation and the atmosphere in the Gaza Strip. Another role that the Israeli government should talk about or think about is whether there is a chance or an interest or political desire to translate rehabilitation moves in the Gaza Strip to a sort of move of rehabilitating the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians. Because clearly, when we have come to a dead end politically, when the negotiations with Fatah and Hamas have also come to a dead end, that is part of the reason for the rehabilitation. We know that there is a problem with the transfer of funds. So we're talking about a cycle that someone needs to break. And I think that one of the elements that should have the responsibility, because of its own interests, because of its own worldview, to try and break the cycle is Israel. It is clearly part of the picture. Thank you very much. Bassem is sitting here, and I see a small smile appearing on your face. There are so many things that we'd love to hear from you, but I just want to ask you very simply, who are you representing, in fact? You can define exactly that I am representing those who have died, those who are no longer with us. I think that there are so many such people who were completely innocent in this story, and there was no one there to represent them while they were alive, so perhaps I am the person who will be doing that work, but unfortunately only after their demise. And with your permission, Tali, I would just want to make a comment that is very important. We could have saved this discussion, every word said here, if Israel had not come out or done this engagement, come out and withdrawn from the Gaza Strip. I think that most of the people living in the Gaza Strip that I am directly in contact with, I am corresponding with, and I take testimonies from, and they are saying in Arabic, God will have mercy on the civil administration we had in the Gaza Strip. 10 years down the line, the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are saying, God have mercy on the civil administration. I never thought I would hear this. Allah yarahmu, when you say this in Arabic, you mean I wish it were still around. I wish we could have that back. I think that there is no big difference between, let's say, Abbas and Hamas. I don't see a big difference because Fatah also wants to take revenge, and Fatah has said many times it will take revenge on Israel, and we all know that just a few months ago, Ziad Abu-En, who was killed, who passed away, whatever happened to him, and Fatah and Abbas himself said, we will not let this incident go quietly. Except for one thing, it was obvious there will be some sort of appropriate reaction verbally, rhetorically by Fatah to Hamas statement. But what are the Palestinian security mechanisms doing, apparatuses doing here? They are making sure that Rihad Dawabshe's death will not ignite the entire area. Well, I think the person to thank here is the collaboration between Israel, because who is guiding the Palestinian security mechanisms? It's Salafists in Ramallah. Well, that's exactly the point. Abbas will say whatever he'll say because he has to say this, and he has to be better than his Hamas rival in Gaza. But in fact, the security apparatuses will still continue to collaborate with Israel. And it's not the same as in Gaza. Unless you want to tell me that the Hamas is working with Israel in the south. Well, I don't think so. But if a rebel organization shoots, then Hamas does have to say something. It does say it's not from them. And they have sometimes even settled accounts with this rebel organization. Well, Tali, I have something to say here. The Israelis, in fact, are always talking about Palestinians, but from the angle or perspective of the leadership rather than the public at large. When you talk about Gaza, you talk about Hamas, and ignore the civilians. When you talk about the West Bank, you talk about Abbas and the security apparatuses, and again ignore the society. Well, Mr. Kuperwasser said that more than 80% in the West Bank want to eliminate Israel. I think that 88% of the Gaza Strip civilians, if you were to open just a single door, they will immigrate from the Gaza Strip and go die at sea by Malta, by Australia, by France. That's exactly what people, because look, people have come to a certain conclusion here, that instead of their death being slow in the Gaza Strip, let us hurry it along, because they're going to die anyway, whether they stay in the Gaza Strip or whether they leave it. So they would rather have this death, reach this death quickly than slowly. And that is how I see things in the Gaza Strip today. I have no doubt that when Hamas declared that the Gaza Strip will be the Jewish cemetery, I think it will be first of all the Gaza people's cemetery, and then maybe if there will be room, then it will also be a cemetery for Jews. I think that Hamas is burying its people alive, people whose homes were demolished for more than a year and are now sitting by the ruins of their homes. I don't think that is an organization that is going to get any support by the Palestinians. I know that if you tomorrow were to contact anyone from the Gaza Strip, of course they will yell and say they want to annihilate the state of Israel. But when I talk to them, I think they a huge change, a huge difference. It will be from what you hear from them and what I hear from them. So what? Hamas is a paper tiger? I think it's someone else's tiger. It's not the Palestinians' tiger, maybe the Iranian tiger, much more than the Palestinian one. Yes, you're right. We brought Hamas to power, but not in order to support the Hamas ideology. What has pushed us to elect Hamas and vote for Hamas is revenge on Fatah and the corruption from Fatah that were both in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. So we said, what are the alternatives? What are the alternatives? We did not know that this is what we'll be getting, and that Gaza, after the Israeli disengagement, will be undergoing 3 huge wars, and the victims, the main victims of all of these wars, were the civilians and not the Hamas people. Thank you very much. Shalom Harari. Please take it straight from what Bassem has said. First of all, good afternoon. As a person who has worked in Madaniya for dozens of years, I'm now going to be a Marachum. I want to talk about what Bassem has said and also about what the commander of the Southern Command has said, Turgeman. Sami Turgeman has said that Hamas' main objective is to reach a Sharia state across Palestine. But it has also two other objectives that are also important, and Israelis ignore most of the time. The first objective is, the first of the two, is what Mash'al has said in many famous interviews in Al-Aram as well. He called it Ashaf PLO 3. Just like Arafat had overtaken the first PLO and brought in the Fatah, now we, Hamas, will take over the Fatah's PLO, if we can call it that, and come to with a new idea, the third PLO, resistance that is different than Abu Mazen's and the Fatah's resistance. That is the first aim. And the second interim objective is to take over Fatah from within. How close are they to achieving this goal? Well, because of their disaster in Egypt, Sisi getting to power, they felt more close to their objective when Morsi was in power. But now what will determine this is how you will see this, the shifting stance. This is an Arafat, by the way. This is an Arafat figure of speech. He used to call it the shifting stance. It all depends on how the Middle East will be in 2 or 3 years' time. They look much further ahead. Our governments look ahead 4 years, they look ahead many more years than that. The second interim objective is to take over the West Bank. He said, I've already taken over the Gaza Strip, now I want to take over the West Bank, and Hamas is going there in 2 ways. First of all, preserving, maintaining and developing the civil structures, and what's worse, having an HQ in Turkey. Building or attempting to build military infrastructure that will do such things such as taking revenge for the death of Riham in hospital yesterday, but not here, not in my backyard, not from Gaza, because from there I would like to retain the calm, because the civilians have been badly hit, but with my enemy, Abu Mazen. And the idea is to bring it about so that Abu Mazen collapses from within. And what is he saying? I am a well-known organization. Abu Mazen represents negotiations and betrayal. I want to show that my way, despite the fact that I am now very much restricted in the Gaza Strip, I can still do it elsewhere, whether it's chaos or taking the activity from Sami, from the Southern Command, to the Central Command, not only to the Jerusalem area. They are seeing the West Bank and Jerusalem as a single system. So Abu Mazen is embarrassed here. He is befuddled because the way the path he has taken for the last 20 years, negotiations, is no longer fertile. And Bibi, as far as they're seeing, is looking to conflict management rather than conflict resolution. And the slogans that Bibi is talking about is to go back, or that's what he talked about. The election is to go back on the idea of the 2-state from his Bar-Ilan speech. And so they don't need to think, because both the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense are talking about managing the conflict. Yes, but they want to see how it is on the ground. So I'll give you an example. Let's say the commander of the Southern Command talks about the activities and actions in Ramadan. And people didn't understand this, but they were offered religiously to have dozens of hundreds of buses go out from the Gaza Strip to make sure that it's only people praying to go all the way to Temple Mount. And they said, no, we don't want to have this. You can look, search through the buses. And the Palestinians couldn't go and pray on Temple Mount because of this matter. So you see this different kind of path. They're trying to boycott Israeli industrial zones. The PA's response to this way of controversy is when we have Hamas units being arrested. Well, we didn't hear about the Kfar Duma terrorists being arrested. Well, yes, maybe there's something on the way, but we see this as part of the struggle for the third PLO. We're talking about a battle for this. So don't confuse this with Sharia, which is something else. Both Abu Mazen and Hamas have not had elections for 10 years. They are no longer formally legitimized in society, and therefore they need to look for legitimacy. They are within a battle for legitimacy now. For instance, having terrorist attacks in the West Bank, and so on and so forth. And if I were to say, then I would sum up and say that Hamas is in a situation that reminds me of a Hebronian saying. You know that Hebronians like to grow vines and grapes in levels. I'm sure that many people here know about the Hebron grapes. They're very sweet. And in this vineyard, there is a place where you put the God. It's called the El Natur. And as kids, we would go to steal a watermelon or figs. And the saying says, decide what you want. Decide what you want, to eat grapes or to hit the God. You can't do both. And that's what Sami has made very clear, and his people, of course, in the Protective Edge, and that is my position. The internal position of Hamas, from their angle, their secret assumption is that they have been defeated in the last operation. None of the 7 aims they had were achieved. They asked for a ceasefire in Cairo, and they didn't get anything. And if we have polls now done by Palestinian institutions, you see the answers. The West Bank think that 80% of the West Bank society think that there was no real victory. So if you want to eat grapes, if you want to have a good life, for society, that's one way. The other way is to fight the IDF.
Sami, you said beforehand that we also see as an objective to topple the Hamas in the Gaza Strip, just like they want to get rid of us. So who would you say is the element that could possibly take over in the Gaza Strip? Well, I think, yes, the supra objective of the Hamas is to actually stop this project, which has been called, in other words, eradicate Israel, and they're looking out towards Judea and Samaria. And if on the 30th of June 2013 if it had not taken place, then perhaps he would have spread out and gone further. Therefore, it's very difficult to see a reality wherein their long-range objectives are as such that we might reach an agreement. It's difficult to imagine such a situation, but I can't talk on behalf of the government. But as we can see clearly that it's only the Palestinian Authority is that element. Yes, true, it's not relevant at the moment. It doesn't have the capabilities. And it can't actually sort of contain any basic capabilities. So therefore, the sovereign at the moment in the Gaza Strip is the Hamas, and everything turns and swivels around it. But it is because otherwise there will be a total governmental chaos, anarchy in the Gaza Strip. So it would be better if they deal with the 46% of unemployed, which is the Hamas, and let us question our capability of solving these elemental basic problems alone, those that exist in the Gaza Strip. That in itself is such a heavy burden burden and mission. In order to truly grapple with that situation, we need an enormous effort, an international effort, because we really need to know how to solve all the issues there. We can't do it alone. You said that when you said the 30th of June, you're talking about what happened on the 30th of June. We're talking about Morsi's toppling. But Israel enabled the Palestinian Authority. Had the Israelis not enabled them to have elections and the Hamas not been elected, maybe we would have found ourselves, we sort of wielded to American pressure. Maybe the situation would have been different. Okay, when you talk about the mistakes that happened in the past, okay, that's spilled milk. We're now living the reality that was created because of that. There were some very good things that happened that actually was said, and not only actual mistakes that were made. I mean, at the moment, there are 3 states that exist. There's no logic at the moment that Hamas will allow Fatah to come into the Gaza Strip, just as the Fatah won't allow Hamas into Judea and Samaria. So at the moment, we have to understand that the Hamas is retaining the situation as is, and despite all the crisis and distress that were described correctly, the Hamas don't feel that they have any challenge that they have to face by actually forcing a situation and making it better in the Gaza Strip. So when we talk about the state of Israel or the United States being sovereigns, they don't particularly want to be a sovereign there. A sovereign is the kind of has the monopoly on the use of force. So it's actually not only them. There are those in the Judea and Samaria beyond the PLO that use force, other organizations, and the same in the Gaza Strip. It's not only Hamas. Yes, we have to worry about the population for humanitarian reasons, but simultaneously we are enabling our rivals to equip themselves with extremist ideology of hatred towards us, but also of real arms that could cause tremendous harm against us, including the tunnels. So we have to see how we manage this situation so that this alleviation of a humanitarian situation doesn't suddenly become a two-edged sword in our hands. So we see that the mechanism that was developed in order to bring in international aid into the Gaza Strip failed because the Hamas has declared, yes, that we are using this aid to build our military capabilities. So we have to see what we can do in order to still help them and yet not make it a two-edged sword. Now, I think if you think that you can, Abu Mazen does not want to use terror and fire in the same way that they want to use it, but but Abu Mazen does support the populistic liberation movement. So we have to remember that he's not trying to prevent the strengthening and reinforcing of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. I mean, we have to differentiate between various situations. So we have to not only struggle against the BDS and all the other things, but also the popular sort of liberation movements as well. It's not only the bigger things. So I think that if we look, if we think about not only solving the situation, I think that in that situation, Abu Mazen is one situation where he's not willing to give up Haifa, for example. No, but Barak, 2 nations for 3 nations for 2 people from what you're saying? No, I think that ultimately we won't be able to create a situation of 3 states. We just need time and patience, and I believe that the processes will mature, and in the end it will be 2 nations. Our need to keep the Hamas in a good place in the middle between Fatah and Salafiyah, does that also have a role? I think that the Southern Commander said it very clearly. Our aim is to topple the Hamas and bring in the PA, the Palestinian Authority, because of their open declarations about what they want. I mean, they say it perhaps in various ways, but the bottom line is our eradication. So the Hamas is the sovereign in Gaza. You can argue in various ways about it, but they are the sovereign, and therefore you can't relate to reality as it is. But yes, when you talk about 3 states for 2 peoples, I think would be a very big mistake. Anat, Kurz, when you talk about 3 states for 2 peoples, you said that there won't be a security without Hamas and that there won't be a political process, a peace process without the other. No, basically we're talking about the management of a conflict, and that is no simple daily task. And there isn't a political peace sort of negotiation, but we at least have an official partner who has not as yet actually abandoned his post. So we have to understand that with all the inconvenience, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has developed into 3 conflicts: Israel and Hamas, Israel and Fatah, and between Fatah and Hamas. I mean, if I'm doing a sort of reduction of the description of the situation. And I sincerely think that if there is any solution, then it'll be the 2-state solution. There is no other possible one. So we have to find a way of mediating and bridging the gaps on those 3 planes that seem to be nurturing and feeding into each other that have brought us to the situation we find ourselves in today. So I'm not trying to say that there's something we can do today whose results will be immediately significant tomorrow. But all I'm trying to say that we have to choose the path that we want to walk on. And there are enough good reasons for the sake of Israel that we should leave what you say and forget all those that we say sort of, you know, only want human rights, etc. But Israel really does want to calm. It has a vested interest of calming the situation in Gaza Strip, and at the same time, they should not alienate a potential partner that they have, even if it doesn't have, at the moment, practical implications. Because without the PA, without Abu Mazen, then we won't have any chance whatsoever. So therefore, we've got to walk on that tightrope, avoid fighting and going going to blows with the guard in the vineyard, and sort of eat the grapes and all of it together, if I'm using your proverb. But we need somehow to rehabilitate the Gaza Strip, and simultaneously we need to be very careful not to lose our Palestinian partner. I think that because otherwise we find ourselves into a situation of a countdown till the next Protective Edge mission campaign. Is the solution 3 states for 2 peoples? I mean, is that the situation as you envision it? I think that the time has come for the Palestinians themselves as a society to be interwoven into this process and integrated, and not agree not to be captives to Hamas in the Gaza Strip or to Abu Mazen in Judea and Samaria. I think, but you know, someone rang me up from Gaza and said, if the Iranian Spring succeeded, then the Gaza Spring will also succeed. So I understand the depression, which is the regime, the Hamas regime in Gaza Strip, which they're trying to actually reign in Gaza. But no less than that, you have a very similar situation in Judea and Samaria. Someone once asked me, a journalist from Canada, asked me, now she's the Canadian ambassador, I think her name is Vivian Berkovich, and she interviewed me. She used to write a column in the Star in Canada, and she asked me about the freedom of expression and what happens in the newspapers and in the media. And then she asked me, Bassem, is there a freedom of expression under the Palestinian Authority? And I said, yes, a lot of freedom of expression. And she shouted at me, so what's your problem then? She said, so I said that my problem is there's no freedom after the expression. Thank you very much. Shalom, Harari. 3 states for 2 peoples. Well, if I look at the situation, 2 Palestinian states wherein each one has its own demarcated borders, each one with its own real government. We could even call it a shadow government. And Wifaka Matan, it might be a circus, by the way, and a different kind of taxation system, legal system, different armies. So here you're creating a situation where you have 2 different governments. And I will just like to say in summary, and I use the word legitimacy. Is that the desired situation? All I'm saying is if we do reach some kind of agreement with Abu Mazen, and it'll be shelved for a while, I'd like to say that until we have a legitimate Palestinian elected representation, one singular one, and believe me, I participated in the negotiations not only in Madrid, but also in Oslo, and I'm willing to give a great deal and cede a great deal, but I'm saying that if we do not have a legitimate partner, there's no point signing anything, because it'll just be like writing on ice. In other words, if there are not elections to the parliament, to the presidium, so the presidency, even for the municipalities, they didn't have elections. Do not sign anything. You need an elected, real representation. Otherwise, it's a fictitious address. There's no one to approach, no one that you can write to. Okay, we spoke about a countdown to the next protective edge. Is it really, has that countdown started? I think that the Hamas is still licking its wounds from protective edge, and the Gaza Strip is still under that influence of protective edge, especially the population that suffered it. And so if I look at the leadership and if I look at the population, both of them do not want protective edge 2, and they do not want the next campaign. Yes, admittedly, the conditions are very dire, but you have to remember that this strip is isolated and disconnected, engaged, and that the Egyptians disconnected and will not reconnect. The Palestinian Authority disconnected, and they can't even connect. So therefore, this strip needs to somehow manage itself in this rehabilitation, but they still have to also prepare their military capabilities, re-prepare them. The Hamas will make a very severe mistake if they think that they will always last, if they can think that they can continue surviving unless they take major steps there. So I wish you all peace and a good year.